Imagine for a second that you found a smartphone buried perfectly intact inside a fossilized dinosaur footprint. You would question everything you knew about history, right? Well, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt experienced a very similar feeling. He was walking across a gentle, rolling hill in southeastern Turkey, a place the locals called Potbelly Hill. Sticking out of the dry earth were the tops of massive, intricately carved limestone pillars. But they shouldn't have been there. According to every history book ever written, the people alive when these stones were erected were simple hunter-gatherers. They wore animal skins, they chased wild game with stone-tipped spears, and they definitely didn't build colossal, meticulously aligned temples. Yet, here it was. Welcome to Gobekli Tepe, the place that completely broke the timeline of human history. To really grasp why this place gives archaeologists sleepless nights, we have to rewind the clock. Picture yourself 12,000 years ago, right around the end of the last ice age. Forget the Great Pyramids of Giza. Forget Stonehenge. Those are practically modern history compared to this. When the very first stones of Stonehenge were being dragged into place, Gobekli Tepe was already ancient. It had already been built, used, and completely forgotten for over 6,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. The gap in time between Gobekli Tepe and Stonehenge is actually larger than the gap between Stonehenge and you sitting here listening to this right now. At this point in time, humanity wasn't supposed to know how to do anything more complicated than build a fire and maybe stitch a decent leather tunic. We were nomads. The golden rule of anthropology has always been that humans needed to invent farming before they could settle down. The logic makes perfect sense on paper. You plant crops. You stay in one place to tend them. You build a village, you get some free time because you aren't hunting all day, and then, eventually, you invent architecture, religion, and monumental art. But Gobekli Tepe takes that textbook and throws it right out the window. The builders of this site were entirely nomadic hunter-gatherers. They didn't have agriculture. They didn't have domesticated animals, except maybe some very early, very wolf-like dogs hanging around their camps. They didn't have the wheel. They certainly didn't have metal tools. They had rock, bone, wood, and their own two hands. And yet, with just those primitive tools, they managed to carve out massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them towering 18 feet high and weighing up to 20 tons. For context, 20 tons is roughly the weight of 3 fully grown African elephants, or about a dozen average cars. And they didn't just carve 1 or 2 of these pillars as a fluke. Ground-penetrating radar shows that there are at least 200 of these massive stones, arranged in roughly 20 distinct circular enclosures spread out across the hill. So far, only a fraction of the site has actually been excavated. The scale of the project is so mind-bogglingly huge that it demands we ask one simple, desperate question. How? How did a scattered group of Ice Age foragers, who supposedly spent every waking moment just trying to survive, organize themselves to build a sprawling megalithic complex? The answer begins just a few hundred yards away from the main site, in the ancient limestone quarries. Fortunately for our Ice Age architects, the bedrock beneath Gobekli Tepe is a relatively soft limestone. I say relatively soft, but try hitting it with your bare hand and you'll still break your knuckles. To carve this rock without iron, steel, or bronze, they had to use harder rocks. Specifically, they relied on tools made of flint and obsidian, chipping away at the earth, one exhausting strike at a time. Picture the scene. It's a hot, dusty day, 11 millennia ago. A crew of workers is kneeling on the bare bedrock, armed with heavy, sharpened flint cobbles. They aren't just hacking away randomly. They are meticulously chipping a deep trench into the solid stone floor, creating the outline of a massive T-shape. They aren't building a pillar by stacking blocks on top of each other. They are freeing a single, monolithic piece from the earth itself. It's an agonizingly slow process. Every strike removes just a tiny fraction of an inch of stone. We are talking about weeks, maybe months, of bone-rattling, blister-inducing labor just to carve out the rough shape of one single pillar. And we actually know exactly how they did it, because they left us a prehistoric cheat sheet. Just down the slope from the main excavation, archaeologists found a massive, unfinished pillar still sitting in its bedrock matrix. It's a jaw-dropping 23 feet long, and it is estimated to weigh around 50 tons. For some reason, maybe a microscopic crack formed in the stone, or maybe the foreman realized it was just too heavy. They walked away and left it there. It gives us a perfect, frozen snapshot of ancient engineering in progress. But let's say your crew successfully carves out a 20-ton pillar without cracking it. Congratulations. Now you have to move it out of the quarry and drag it up a hill. Remember, you have no wheels, no horses, no oxen, and no pulleys. You have raw human muscle and absolute sheer will. How do you move a stone that weighs as much as 3 elephants? You use the oldest trick in the engineering book: friction reduction and leverage. They likely used heavy wooden levers, thick, sturdy tree trunks, to pry the carved pillar up just enough to slip thick ropes underneath it. These ropes would have been painstakingly braided from tough plant fibers or animal sinews. Then, they would slide wooden rollers, essentially just stripped logs, under the belly of the stone. Now comes the really dangerous part. You need people. A lot of people. Engineering estimates suggest it would take at least 50 to 100 highly coordinated, incredibly strong individuals, pulling in perfect unison just to budge a 20-ton stone, let alone haul it up a dusty incline. One slip, one snapped rope, or one rolling log kicking out at the wrong angle, and you have a fatal disaster on your hands. The coordination required for this is staggering. Someone had to be shouting orders. Someone had to be keeping the rhythm. There had to be a clearly defined hierarchy, a leader, a project manager of the Ice Age. This entirely shatters the old idea that hunter-gatherers were just small, unorganized bands of wandering families barely surviving. To pull off this kind of heavy lifting, you need distinct groups coming together, cooperating, and following a unified architectural plan. And they didn't just drag these stones into a random pile. Once they got them to the top of the hill, they had to stand them upright, sliding them perfectly into narrow carved sockets in the bedrock floor, to keep them from tipping over. It was a prehistoric balancing act of epic proportions. But moving the stones is only half the battle. If you have hundreds of workers sweating away in a quarry, dragging massive rocks, and erecting a temple, those people are burning thousands of calories a day. And here is where the mystery deepens even further. If they weren't farmers, and there were no fields of crops to harvest, how on earth did they feed a monumental construction crew in the middle of a dry, unforgiving landscape? To understand how you cater a megalithic construction site without a single farm, you have to erase the image of the dry, dusty landscape that surrounds Gobekli Tepe today. 11,600 years ago, this region was a totally different world. It was a lush, vibrant oasis at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. Picture rolling green hills, dense forests of oak and pistachio trees, and sweeping grasslands. And most importantly, it was absolutely teeming with wildlife. When archaeologists started digging around the pillars, they didn't just find dirt and rocks. They found prehistoric garbage. Specifically, they uncovered ancient trash pits filled with over 100,000 animal bone fragments. When the experts analyzed these bones, they realized they weren't looking at the remains of a typical hunter-gatherer campsite. They were looking at the leftovers of the greatest barbecues ever thrown. The vast majority of these bones belonged to gazelles, along with wild boars, red deer, and aurochs, which were essentially giant, highly aggressive ancient cows. The sheer volume of meat required to leave behind this many bones is staggering. It tells us that these builders weren't just scraping by on meager rations. They were feasting on an epic scale. Imagine the atmosphere. It's not a grim, silent work camp. It's a massive, roaring festival. You have different nomadic tribes traveling from miles away, converging on this one hill. They are bringing massive hauls of hunted game with them. The fires are blazing, meat is roasting, and people who would normally be isolated in small family bands are suddenly mixing, trading stories, and working together. The promise of these massive communal feasts might have been the exact incentive needed to recruit the huge labor force required to move those 20-ton stones. But you can't fuel a construction crew on meat alone. Human bodies need carbohydrates. And this is where Gobekli Tepe drops another bombshell on our understanding of human history. The hills surrounding the site happen to be the natural genetic homeland of wild einkorn wheat. This is the wild ancestor of the very same grains sitting in your pantry right now. Scattered all across Gobekli Tepe, researchers have found large stone mortars, pestles, and grinding bowls. The builders were hauling in huge quantities of this wild wheat and grinding it down by hand. Some scientists even suspect they weren't just baking early bread. They might have been using large limestone vats found on site to ferment wild grains and brew primitive beer. Think about that for a second. The motivation to gather and build the world's first massive architectural complex might have been aided by the desire to host the world's first massive block party, complete with barbecue and a prehistoric brew. The logistics of this operation are what truly blow the mind, because it required a highly specialized division of labor that simply wasn't supposed to exist yet. Think of the immense trust involved here. If you spend your entire day striking a flint chisel against a limestone pillar, you aren't hunting. You are entirely dependent on someone else to keep you alive. There had to be dedicated teams of hunters tracking the gazelle migrations. There had to be teams of foragers harvesting fields of wild grain. There were cooks, toolmakers, and project managers. This wasn't just a group of cavemen stacking rocks. It was a functioning, highly organized society. They had created the social structure of a bustling town, thousands of years before the first true town was ever built. They had clearly mastered the how of surviving and building together. But the ultimate mystery remains the why. What could possibly motivate these ancient people to organize on such a massive, exhausting scale? To find that answer, we have to look closely at what they actually carved onto the stones. When you walk among the circular enclosures of Gobekli Tepe, you immediately realize these aren't just blank blocks of stone. They are massive canvases, and the art carved into them is intense, aggressive, and utterly mesmerizing. The builders didn't just scratch faint lines into the rock. They carved in high relief, meticulously chiseling away the background stone, so that the figures literally leap out at you in 3 dimensions. What kind of animals did they carve? You might logically expect the animals they relied on for food, the gazelles and deer we just talked about. But no. The pillars are crawling with predators and venomous creatures. We see snarling foxes, lunging lions, massive spiders, and menacing scorpions. We see wild boars with massive tusks and flocks of vultures with outstretched wings. These aren't the gentle scenes of a prehistoric pastoral life. This is a fierce, terrifying menagerie. Why dedicate hundreds of hours to carving a giant scorpion? Archaeologists believe these animals weren't meant to represent dinner. They were mythic symbols, perhaps spirit animals, totems, or fierce guardians, meant to protect the massive pillars they inhabit. And speaking of those pillars, the T-shape itself isn't just a clever architectural choice to support a roof. It is a stylized human body. When you look closely at the narrow edges of the tallest central pillars, you can clearly see carved arms dropping down, ending in hands with long fingers folding over a carved belt, complete with a loincloth made of a fox pelt. But they have no faces. They are towering, faceless beings looming over the circular rooms, surrounded by dangerous animals. Are they gods? Are they revered ancestors? We don't know for sure, but standing in the center of that stone circle, you can't help but feel you are standing in the middle of a deeply sacred, perhaps terrifying cosmic narrative. Some researchers even look at the famous Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, and see a prehistoric sky map, hypothesizing that the animal carvings represent ancient constellations tracking a changing night sky. Whether it's a map of the stars or a map of the underworld, it is clearly a blueprint of their universe. But here is where the story of Gobekli Tepe takes a turn that leaves scientists completely baffled. This is the absolute climax of this ancient mystery. Imagine the immense effort we have talked about so far. The centuries of quarrying, the agonizing transport, the intricate carving, the massive feasts, the delicate social balancing act. They maintained this site for over 1,000 years, continually building new rings, modifying older ones, and treating this hill as the absolute center of their world. And then, around 8,000 BCE, they did the unthinkable. They didn't just slowly abandon the site to go hunt somewhere else. They didn't leave it to crumble in the wind or be taken over by rival tribes. They buried it, on purpose. They mobilized that exact same massive, highly organized workforce. But this time, not to build. They went out and gathered thousands of tons of dirt, limestone rubble, and animal bones. They hauled it all back up the hill, basket by agonizing basket, and systematically filled in the monumental enclosures they had bled to create. They packed the dirt tight, completely swallowing the 20-ton, 18-foot-tall gods, the snarling foxes, and the terrifying scorpions. They erased their masterpiece from the face of the earth, sealing it away inside a perfectly preserved artificial hill. It is a mind-bending twist. Why would a society spend a millennium building the greatest monument the world had ever seen, only to spend unthinkable energy wiping it off the map? Were they hiding it from a coming threat? Were they decommissioning a sacred temple that had served its purpose, kind of like respectfully retiring a worn-out flag? Or did their religion fundamentally change as the world around them shifted? The truth is, the answer to why they buried Gobekli Tepe might be tied directly to that shifting world, and it reveals the biggest plot twist in the entire story of human evolution. For over a century, the textbook narrative of civilization was a simple, linear progression. First, humans stumbled upon farming. Once we had a stable food supply, we settled down into villages. With the free time gained from not constantly chasing mammoths or foraging for berries, we finally invented complex society, organized religions, and built monumental temples. Agriculture was the spark, and civilization was the fire. But the buried stones of Potbelly Hill flipped that script entirely upside down. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who brought this site to the world's attention, summarized the new reality with one profound sentence. First came the temple, then the city. The timeline at Gobekli Tepe proves that the human urge to gather, to worship, and to build massive monuments actually came before we figured out how to farm. In fact, the desire to build these cosmic blueprints was likely the exact reason agriculture was invented in the first place. Think about the logistics we discussed earlier. You have thousands of people gathering at this site, chipping away at 20-ton pillars, and throwing massive feasts. As generation after generation continued this exhausting work, relying on wild gazelle and wild wheat became incredibly risky. If a drought hit, the spiritual center of their world would collapse. They needed a reliable way to feed the builders. They couldn't trust nature to provide the catering anymore, so they took control of it. They started saving the best seeds of wild wheat and planting them intentionally. In a desperate bid to keep their sacred construction site running, these visionary hunter-gatherers accidentally domesticated crops. They didn't settle down because they invented farming. They invented farming because they refused to leave their temple. This fundamentally changes how we view ourselves as a species. We are not just biological machines driven by the need for calories. Long before we secured our basic survival, we were driven by a profound, overwhelming need for meaning. We wanted to understand the cosmos and connect with something larger than our individual selves. That shared imagination, the ability to unite around a belief, is the true superpower of humanity. And perhaps that explains the deliberate burial of the site. As these ancient people mastered agriculture, their relationship with the natural world completely transformed. They were becoming masters of their environment rather than subjects to it. The terrifying world of lunging foxes and venomous scorpions, carved on those pillars, didn't reflect their new reality as farmers controlling the land. So, they respectfully decommissioned it. They gave their ancient worldview a proper burial, sealing away the hunter-gatherer era beneath tons of earth, and walked down the hill to build the first true agricultural settlements. They buried a temple, but they gave birth to the modern world. When you look at the skyline of any major city today, you are looking at the direct continuation of a chain reaction that started 11 millennia ago in southern Turkey. The drive that pushed our ancestors to carve those stones is the exact same drive that pushed us to walk on the moon. It leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder. If a group of Stone Age nomads could build something that entirely rewrote human history, what are we building today that might completely baffle the archaeologists of the future? If you enjoyed this deep dive into our ancient past, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment down below. Do you think the builders of Gobekli Tepe knew they were changing the world? Or were they just trying to appease their gods? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.